As Rajesh said, I've had the privilege of accompanying Priya along many aspects of its journey over the last over 40 years. The impulse for popular participation, to have a voice in shaping our lives and futures, is age-old. But to understand how this unfolded in Priya's work, we must remember the historical moment in which Priya was founded some 40 years ago. In the late 70s and early 80s, the emerging demand for popular participation in the development field was a strong one, fueled by statements from the FAO, WHO, and other UN agencies, building on an agenda of the right to development, coming on the heels of national liberations and new independence in many countries. Already we can feel that that moment was maybe so different from the one in which we find ourselves today, to which I'll come at the end. Proponents of participation built on the work of Paulo Freire and others, calling for the strengthening of popular knowledge as well as for popular participation. Indeed, this dual agenda of strengthening and recovering people's knowledge in order to strengthen people's voices and power has been at the core of Priya's mission now for over 4 decades. But while this has been its mission, over the years, the meanings of participation and the focus on where and how to make it happen have constantly shifted in both development and democratic discourse. Priya's work has shifted with these changes, and indeed, sometimes it contributed to making the changes happen. I want to look briefly at 5 different meanings of participation over the last 40 years, and in each one illustrate how Priya carried out work in that area. As Rajesh has already put forward, in the early days, we thought of participation as participation from below, as the demands of the excluded. In its early days, popular participation was seen as a process through which those who had been excluded from key decisions asserted their demands for inclusion. In this view, participation is about challenging power, about increasing control over one's futures. It sees participation as more than consultation with random individuals or loosely defined communities. Rather, it sees the participation of the excluded as realizing power through organized groups and social movements, which have the awareness and capacity to articulate and negotiate their demands. Priya's early work with forest dwellers in the early 1980s to help them gain control over their resources, or its efforts at social mobilization of rural women, utilizing both Gandhian and Freirean principles of learning from everyday life to build confidence in their own knowledge, perhaps reflected this meaning. But over time, the meaning of participation evolved to one of beneficiaries and users. During the 1980s and 90s, we saw participation become an ingredient of more formalized development projects. While opening up space for people's knowledge and involvement in development planning and implementation, this beneficiary approach still often positioned people more passively as users and choosers in externally defined and led initiatives, rather than as makers and shapers of their own policies, programs, or futures. Again, Priya responded throughout the 1990s, holding schools for participation, helping NGOs and other actors to understand its more radical historical roots, the tools and approaches which could best be used for implementation, and trying to hold on to the concept of participation as a tool for transforming power, not only for implementing development projects. I remember well being part of many of those schools there in the Priya building with Namar Tajatli and many others around India, and I learned so much from that process. As participation began to scale up, the word also shifted to participation as stakeholders, stakeholder involvement. During the 1990s, with the mainstreaming of participation in large-scale development programs, terms like excluded began to give way to this more mainstream development discourse. In 1994, the World Bank Participation Learning Group, after considerable discussion, arrived at the following definition. Participation is a process through which stakeholders, not beneficiaries, not the excluded, not the poor, which stakeholders influence and share control over development initiatives and the decisions and resources which affect them. While this shift created space and support for participatory processes at very high levels, the term stakeholder was neutral, ambiguous, no longer meaning the excluded, but also meaning the involvement of private sector, government, large NGOs, or other powerful actors. I met with a World Bank team one time and said, of course, we've had the participatory process. We had the head of the Chamber of Commerce, somebody from the Department of Treasury, and the head of the largest NGO in the country to lunch, and we consulted. A different notion of participation than participation from below. And again, as a member and leader of the civil society working group on the World Bank, Priya fought to create these spaces, but also to modify this language, to include the term primary stakeholders, that is, to privilege the knowledge and participation of the poor or those at the grassroots levels in these processes. Rajesh, I have vivid memories, you probably recall as well, of a large civil society gathering of several hundred people in the conference room of the World Bank in Washington, where you delivered an impassioned call, a manifesto from civil society for more robust meetings of participation. You spoke to James Wolfenson, the World Bank president at the time, and other bank officials. Working with NGOs around the world, Priya was a leader in these global debates about scaling up participation while also holding on to its more progressive meanings. But over time, we also began to discuss, as Shamshika pointed out, participation as a right of citizenship, not as an invitation to participate in somebody else's program or project. While much of the work on participation had emerged in the development arena, it began to be linked to concepts of citizenship and to deepening forms of democratic governance. In the 1990s, in many countries, including India, democratic decentralization opened up new spaces for citizen engagement. And in this context, it was perhaps natural that the demand for participation in development processes should also lead to the demand for participation in governance processes, giving rise to new concepts and discourses of participatory governance and participatory citizenship. Again, Priya played a key role through its work on deepening participation, especially of women and Dalits in the Panchayati Raj institutions, where a key constitutional amendment created new spaces for their voice and presence. Priya was part of LogoLink, a global network to develop learning on participatory governance. At that time, we also worked together for a decade on a program focusing on citizenship and participation, where Priya's work on the rights of migrant workers within India or the struggles around natural resources in Jharkhand provided critical inputs to our global debates. The book, the Sage Volume on Participatory Citizenship, edited by Rajesh and Ranjita Mohanty, is still a great contribution to these debates, where some of what I'm narrating now, I also published there. But by the early 2000s, the word participation began to be attached to the words transparency and accountability. We had this new acronym of participation, transparency, accountability. Much of the attention now was on how citizens could engage in policies by holding institutions to account for such policies. In other words, this shifted the emphasis downstream, moving away from participatory ways of stating your needs, of agenda setting, to focusing on the accountability of leaders and institutions to meet development and democratic goals. Aided by demands for transparency of information, the accountability agenda once again fueled new participatory innovations in what became known as social accountability. And here again, Priya played a key role, Kostov playing an important role, and others, with new programs in Cambodia and Bangladesh, as well as its work in democratic engagement and urban governance, now a key issue in India's growing cities. So this is just a very high level gallop across what is a practice of very rich and nuanced history. A lot of Priya's work hasn't been fully mentioned. But across these changing meanings over the last 4 decades, much has been learned. And particularly, we have learned that while participation can be used as an approach for exercising voice and accountability, for protecting and demanding rights, For deepening democratic institutions, it is not a panacea. It is also easily subject to misuse and co-optation. It can be used as a tool for placation as well as empowerment, to be reduced to a checkbox of tools or endless forms of consultation that lead to little change, what one writer has called participatory disempowerment. Understandably, a certain weariness or skepticism about the term has set in many quarters. And yet PREA's goal and focus and commitment has always been to achieving meaningful participation, participation that was important for people's lives. And to realize this, we have learned at least 4 key lessons, some of which Rajesh has already mentioned. First, participation is about inclusion, especially of marginalized voices. PREA's commitment to strengthening women's voices, whether in the panchayats or over issues of sexual harassment in the workplace, as well as its work over the last 10 years on listening to and supporting youth voices, such as its Youth and Everyday Democracy program, are part of this theme. Secondly, participation is about transforming power. For participation to be transformative in people's lives, it must also involve participation in decisions that shift power, shift control over resources. Participation is a way of bringing the word power back into the word empowerment. Third, participation occurs in many spaces, through people's popular struggles, as well as in invited spaces of consultation and deliberation. It is about organizing collective efforts, not only about listening to individual voices or the rapidly emerging trend to clicktivism, pressing the button on the computer and thinking that is full participation. Finally, participation is about learning. It's about building awareness, what Paulo Freire would call conscientization. In most situations of high inequality and exclusion, we cannot take for granted that participation of active, of aware citizens is a starting point. Rather, participation, especially of the powerless, is a way to build that consciousness, to discover a sense of rights and agency, to help strengthen the skills and networks through which people learn to become more active, aware, and empowered. With these 4 principles in mind, huge gains have been made over the last 40 years in deepening the quality, the scope, and depth of participation in many spaces and issues around the world. In addition to PREA, I'm very pleased, for instance, to be sharing the panel with Praxis, which has pioneered the uses and applications of meaningful tools for participation and trained thousands of activists in their use. And with Participadia, which has now documented and cataloged several thousand of the innovations in participatory governance that have emerged in recent decades. But while we want to celebrate this work and accomplishment, we also need to recognize that the historical moment in which we now live is very different from when PREA was founded. And when we do so, the picture for participation I find very sobering. Unlike 40 years ago, when the world was at the beginning of several decades of democratic spread and deepening, we are now in a period of democratic recession globally, growing authoritarianism, and with it closing space for civic engagement. Recent research by Civicus shows that now 87%, almost 90% of the world's population live in countries where civic space is rated as closed, repressed, or obstructed. Slightly less than 4% live in so-called open societies, where we might expect participation to be the greatest. Despite decades of work for gender equity and inclusion, we also see around the world backlash against women's rights, both in the public sphere as well as in the household. Such ongoing and increasing violence against women and sexual harassment serves to limit our hopes of inclusion. Despite decades of work on participation, the world is more and more unequal. The huge rise in economic inequality within and across countries means that economic power can often trump, and I use the word advisedly, can trump political and social power. So we work on strengthening social voice, and yet we're dominated by an unequal economic system. After decades of work on strengthening people's knowledge, we live in a world where misinformation, seems as much as a basis of action as truth, spread all the more rapidly through online sources and manipulated by the powerful to their own interest. This fundamentally challenges our core ideas about what authentic popular knowledge is and whose knowledge is used as a basis for action towards deepening development and democracy. And finally, with growing inequality, our societies are also more deeply polarized, divided more and more by old divisions of race, religion, ethnicity, class, gender, as well as new ones, such as the masked and the unmasked. We face challenges not only of strengthening participation of the excluded against the powerful, but also how to use participation to deal with polarization within and across members of the excluded themselves. But each of these challenges, though daunting, give rise to a new agenda for participation. That new agenda for Priya and others is first, not only how to develop new democratic innovations, but how to protect those that we have and fight back against democratic recession and backlash. It's about how to gain more democratic control over the economy, over our workplaces and budgets and taxes and fiscal policies, as well as in social and political institutions. Or it's about how to reassert what we mean by popular knowledge, based on reflection and deep systemization of experience, as opposed to opinions and misinformation fanned by powerful interest. And it's about how to use participation to work across polarization and against increasing polarization. In dealing with these challenges, we are buoyed as ever by the fact that in all these areas, there are already strong popular struggles, initiatives, alliances, coalitions committed to a more just and participatory world. And in working with them, the core principles and lessons that launch Priya's work on participation still remain true, that it is about full inclusion and transforming power at every level, that it is achieved through collective action and coalition built on mutual respect and interest, and that it is built not through recipes from above, but through a process of social learning and reflection, deeply grounded in people's experience and knowledge. As the issues, moments, and meanings of participation continue to evolve in this new era, Priya's work will also continue to change. But with these core principles that we've learned in mind, we have a strong compass to navigate the turbulent and choppy waters ahead. Priya, thank you for the journey, your learning, congratulations, and thanks for the opportunity to accompany you, to learn with you along the way.